Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is another of our conversations on the one-year anniversary of the January 6th attacks on the U.S. Capitol. Thank you very much for tuning in to take a look at this. My name is Rob Similcare. I am from Westport, Connecticut. I am a prospective candidate for Secretary of the State of Connecticut. I have an exploratory committee that I have formed, and voting rights, of course, very much at the center of the conversation these days because of what happened on January 6th. But right now, I'm joined by two people who can help us sort of understand the aftermath of those events, both from a criminal justice point of view, as well as from the point of view of the social impact and the hate side of what we saw that day. First, Mitch Epner. Mitch is a former federal prosecutor in the District of New Jersey, where he served for 3 years. He's now an accomplished trial lawyer. He's handled many major, both civil and criminal matters. He's currently of counsel at the law firm of Rottenberg, Lippman, and Rich. He also happens to be a good friend of mine from Dartmouth College. Mitch, thanks for joining.
Thank you very much for having me, Rob. We first met when you were the best play-by-play person that Dartmouth hockey ever found, and I was your barely competent color man.
You give yourself so little credit, Mitch. You are so much better than that. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And then also I want to just introduce Steve Ginsburg. Steve's a great friend of mine from Connecticut. A lot of folks here in the state know Steve from his tremendous work as the head of the Connecticut region of the Anti-Defamation League. He stepped down from that role earlier this year. He's now president of August, which is a strategic communications firm. But Steve is one of the best people, I think, to talk about some of the issues that we saw so many of, unfortunately, during the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, of hate crime, hate speech, and issues of intolerance that we saw at all levels of American society. Steve, thanks for being with me.
It's great to be here, and nice to meet you, Mitch. And I didn't go to college with you both, but when I was in college, I wasn't even good enough to be on air. I was the producer of live sports in my college cable channel. So I was the guy in the truck.
Well, you know, no good broadcast can happen without a good guy in the truck, or usually about a dozen or two great guys and gals in the truck making it all happen. So thank you very much, Steve, for joining us. So Mitch, I want to start with you on the criminal justice aftermath of the January 6th attacks. The Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, spoke yesterday. It was quite fascinating to watch this speech. And I hadn't heard a lot from Merrick Garland in his time as Attorney General. He'd been sort of a low-key AG. But he came out yesterday, gave a speech, and really the highlight of his speech was, a quote that I wrote down where he said, "The Justice Department remains committed to holding all January 6th perpetrators at any level accountable under the law, whether they were present that day or were otherwise criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy." Mitch, as a former U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney yourself, to see the Attorney General come out, give a speech like that on an ongoing criminal investigation, how did that strike you, and why do you think Attorney General Garland did it?
Okay, so first of all, it was very unusual. The Justice Manual, which used to be called the U.S. Attorney's Manual, specifically instructs that outside of very unusual circumstances, no comment should be given on an ongoing investigation, let alone a case that's already been indicted. And there are specific rules for what you can do for cases that have been indicted. As to why he did this very unusual thing, I think it's because there's a tremendous amount of frustration amongst the American populace about what has happened and what hasn't happened so far. Nobody at the highest levels of government has been prosecuted. Some people have been prosecuted. Roughly 700 people have been charged out of roughly 2,300 people who have been identified as having been there inside of the Capitol. So it seems as if justice has been delayed here, and justice has, to the extent it's been attempted, has only been attempted at the bottom of the pyramid. So I think he was trying to change that narrative. And I think that what he said is easy to say and very hard to accomplish.
And what he said, a lot of what he said yesterday was to your point about the fact that many of the actions that have been brought, there have been now over 700 people arrested and charged with some form of crime, whether they be misdemeanors or felonies from the events of January 6th. There have been more than 5,000 subpoenas and search warrants issued, 2,000 devices seized, more than 300,000 tips from the public, and over 100 guilty pleas, by the way. But he seemed to be, if not defensively, at least explaining why the things had gone from that bottom-up approach. And he talked about a very common tactic you see in criminal investigations, where oftentimes prosecutors will work their way from the bottom up to the sort of masterminds of any given scheme or event. Do you think, Mitch, that approach, which you might see in an organized crime investigation or something of that nature, can work when it comes to something as complex as what happened on January 6th?
I'm very dubious. And the reason I'm dubious is, having run those types of investigations where you start from the bottom up and you try to squeeze like a tube of toothpaste in order to eventually get out from the tippity top, that always assumes that there's knowledge that flows through from the bottom to the top. I'm not certain that's true here. And then there's a much bigger problem that rarely occurs in any other context, and that's some of the actions of elected leaders and even rabble-rousers like Alex Jones arguably are protected by the First Amendment. And there is a real issue about criminalizing unpopular political speech. Now, as a substantive matter, I cannot be strong enough about how much I disapprove of virtually everything that Donald J. Trump has ever done, let alone as president. The only good thing I think he ever did was restore Woolman Rink in Central Park. But
was that him really, though? I mean,
that really was, and unfortunately, it's what he built the myth on.
You're right.
But there is a very real issue about criminalizing the speech of those who lose elections. And we do not want to become Ukraine, where the winner goes to the palace and the loser goes to jail.
Understood. And I think that point is very well taken. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Mitch. I want to go to Steve for a bit about some of the people who were there. And this goes to the question of criminality to some degree, Mitch. But there was a study, Steve, that came out recently. The Atlantic Monthly did a study about the people who were actually there on January 6th. And they took a sample of over 100 of them. And we do talk a lot about the 3%ers and the Proud Boys and the known hate groups who were there that day. But the study shows that was a fairly small minority of people who were involved in the attacks, whether it was people who just walked in and sort of walked around the building, or people who went farther and actually took up arms, committed acts of violence against Capitol Police. Most of these folks were relatively, quote unquote, normal. A lot of them, were middle class to even upper income individuals. A lot of them came from, professional backgrounds. There were lawyers, there were CEOs of companies there. And interestingly, the majority of them came from counties that were won by Joe Biden, not Donald Trump. So these were not people who lived in deep red communities who, were seething with anger about the fact that Trump won. They were seething, but they really came from a lot of blue areas. What does that tell you, Steve, about the mindset of people who ended up in the same place, fighting alongside those members of hate groups who, caused all kinds of problems over the 4 years of Donald Trump?
Yeah. So let me start with this. Mitch mentioned that it was 700 people have been charged with the crime. The latest number that I've seen from ADL and others is that about 140 of them, of those 700, are those who have known extremist group ties prior to January 6th. So what that says to me is, and this was something that I saw a slow erosion of during my time when I was with ADL, and we all saw, is the extremist ideology is becoming mainstreamed. And we can talk about why that happened. But what's really fundamental to this is the way we are receiving information and the way we are getting different narratives is ripe for conspiracy. And I believe that truly a lot of the people who were there believe that it was a big lie, that this was a stolen election. And I was thinking about that finding that a lot of them came from blue counties. It's actually possible that those people were the ones who felt the most that their vote didn't count and that their county should have gone red. I don't know if it was exactly that, but it's not that surprising to me that they came from blue places because, we talk in red and blue, but Connecticut's a very blue state, but there are tons of people who would identify more with the Republican Party, and and so I think that what we've got here is the ideology that ADL and I was working on tracking and monitoring for decades. The idea of the progressive groups and people of color, for example, taking away white America, that is something that the Trump campaign tapped into and people believed. And when they saw their government slipping out of their hands, they just decided not to believe it. And they have people, elected officials, in the media, and in their communities telling them they're right. And so, and then you've got the whole other side hearing a whole other, what I believe is a far more fact-based side of the story. But it's not that, I guess January 6th was shocking to everybody, but it wasn't that surprising that that all those people showed up and took that action.
And this phrase, the big lie, Steve, this is a phrase that we've heard a lot since Donald Trump started contesting the result of the election. And a lot of people don't know the history of that phrase. That phrase has a history that is, when you know it, it's chilling to think that we're talking about the quote unquote big lie in America in 2021 and 22, because that the first time I ever heard that phrase mentioned was in relation to Nazi Germany and the lie that Hitler and Goebbels and others in the Nazi propaganda machine used to perpetrate crimes against the Jewish people in Germany and around Europe. And it's chilling to hear that phrase used in this way, and accurately so.
Yeah, to those who've sort of studied the history of genocide and saw what the Nazi Party did and saw what happened in Europe, the last several years have had a series of co-opting of that time and misapplying what the Nazis did to what's happening here in America. And you never kind of know where it's really going to come from next. But we've certainly seen it with mask mandates and state reps here in Connecticut getting called Hitler. The fact that that's being called the big lie and that the former President Trump is promoting that is incredibly frightening, should be frightening to all Americans, and certainly very hurtful to Jewish people and others who really identify with what happened in the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazi Party. And let me just say this, Trump's 2016 campaign, I think it was included America First, right? And America First was also a fascist ideology. And so it's not, it's a dog whistle. It's a slogan that sounds okay. And then when you dig into it, it's pretty horrifying.
Mitch, I want to go back to you and just talk about quickly the sort of three groups of people who really were part of January 6th and how the law, in your opinion, should treat these three groups going forward. I'll sort of start from the bottom up. And the first group, you could almost call them, you can't call them tourists because they were there as part of a riot, right? But they were essentially there as trespassers. They were there for the rally. They were there to quote unquote stop the steal. They may not have broken a window or even raised a fist against anyone there, a Capitol Police officer or anyone else, but it was their presence there that gave the scale to that crowd that overwhelmed the Capitol Police such that they had to fall back in the way that they did just to try to protect the building and protect the members of Congress. How do you think those people who may not have done anything other than just walk into the building should be treated by the law?
So that's a great question. And the problem comes with the numbers. I believe that in the best of all circumstances, those people would be charged with felonies, but then given relatively light sentences. The problem is when you have hundreds and ultimately thousands of people who you need to prosecute, they're being put into a system that did not have the slack capacity to prosecute thousands of additional people. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been so overwhelmed that they have had to draw in additional prosecutors literally from around the country. There are not enough public defenders to handle all of these cases. So there have been additional public defenders brought in from around the region. And then there aren't enough judges to handle the cases, and the probation office isn't big enough. So the only way that these cases can at all be handled is largely through plea agreements. And in order to get plea agreements, most of that first group of people are being charged not with felonies, but with misdemeanors, because in order to get somebody to agree to plead guilty, you have to give them something better than the worst possible alternative.
And that's why we're seeing so many misdemeanors charged here and accepted. And that's frustrating to a lot of people because it certainly feels like a lot more than jaywalking or some other, what you think of as a misdemeanor to break into the U.S. Capitol during the certification of a presidential election. But there are practical reasons for it, and you explain why. The second group, which of course are the people who committed violent acts, the soldiers, many of whom, by the way, had military backgrounds. You have a lot of people there with either military or law enforcement backgrounds who came with, whether it was weapons, firearms, but in a lot of cases, more likely blunt objects that they either brought or used, hand ties, things like that. All people who either committed violence or certainly were prepared to commit acts of violence that day. How should they be treated?
So I think they appropriately have been charged with felonies. The felony that most of them have been charged with is obstructing government operations. They clearly were there to try to stop the Congress from certifying the election of President Joe Biden. And one thing that I noted before from Steve's statement, he used a phrase that you will never hear across Donald Trump's lips, which is former President Donald Trump. He and his true believers only refer to him as President Trump. The people who did violence or were prepared to do violence, walked away with the podium from the speaker's office, things like that, they have been charged with felonies. The Department of Justice has basically dug in their heels and they've said, whatever it takes in order to bring those people to justice and send them to jail for a significant number of years, we're going to do it. That is going to require enormous resources. It's going to require resources on the prosecution side, on the defense side, within the judiciary, within the probation office. And we have a constitutional guarantee to a speedy trial. We have a statutory guarantee to a trial within 70 days of being indicted. it's going to be very, very difficult for the system to act against these real felons in a way that comports with the law and the Constitution. And this is one time when throwing a lot of resources at a problem actually will make a difference. If you want these people brought to justice, you need to spend the money to have enough prosecutors, enough FBI agents, enough public defenders, enough everybody involved. And when you spend resources on one thing, you do not have the resources to spend on another. Even if you wanted to just throw money at it, you need trained individuals. There are only so many trained assistant U.S. attorneys in the country. If you transfer a lot of them from San Diego to Washington, D.C., there are fewer people who will be prosecuting border crossings. It's a question of where you spend the resources.
It's a resource choice, exactly, how much it matters to bring these people to justice. And then lastly, Mitch, you touched on this earlier, the organizers and the challenges of the First Amendment speech rights of someone like a Donald Trump or a Don Jr. or a Giuliani or some of the people who spoke that day. We know there are limits to First Amendment rights. There's the classic, crying fire in a crowded theater, right? The imminent threat or call to commit imminent acts of violence. Is that what is needed to bring some of these people to justice? Are there people who were organizing in different ways online in Facebook groups, among whether it's hate groups or others, who were simply organizing people to be there, telling them, hey, come ready to fight, come ready to get into the building, and anyone who's found to maybe have even planned ahead of time how to get into the building, where to go in the building? There were some allegations that members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, may have actually been involved in showing some folks around the day or two before those events. What level of criminality can be asserted to some of these people that maybe do not run into the First Amendment protections that they have?
So I consider myself somebody who is a lover of the First Amendment, and this is a difficult line to draw. I think that at a minimum, the First Amendment protection is going to reach, in other words, immune from prosecution will be people who all they did was say, come to DC ready to fight. Come to DC because your rights are being trampled. Come to DC because they're stealing the election. All of those things, while incendiary, are not actionable either criminally or civilly because they are protected by the First Amendment. The line starts to get crossed when somebody doesn't say, come to DC because your rights are being trampled, but rather come to DC, break through this window, go to the third floor, and there you will find Speaker Pelosi and you should do horrible things to her. That is, at that point, that is the verbal act of conspiracy. That is not free speech or something protected by free speech.
And what's interesting, Mitch, and then I'll go back to Steve, in a strange way, the lack of security at the Capitol building that we saw that day, the scant number of Capitol police officers who were on duty, the lack of any National Guard force at the beginning of that day, which was so surprising to any casual observer, myself included that day, can almost help the argument of someone who said, well, I organized people to come, but I didn't think there's any way we were going to storm the building and end up in the Senate chamber because, who knew there'd be so little security there that we could even do that, right? So it almost gives, something of a spontaneity to what happened that day because of the lack of security that allowed all of that to happen.
Yeah, so before you go to Steve, I just want to comment about that. At the time, what I was hearing from friends of mine in law enforcement circles in DC was the military was very concerned about they did not want to be present there, not because they wanted people to storm the Capitol, but they were affirmatively afraid that Donald Trump was going to mobilize the military to seize the building, and that we were going to have an actual order for an armed coup, and therefore the military and the National Guard wanted to be as far afield as they could be, so that the answer to the order wasn't no, but rather, we're not there. We couldn't do it even if we wanted to.
So it's a scary thing to even think that was a conversation at high levels of the U.S. military, but it's not hard to believe that may have been the case. Steve Ginsburg, back to you. When you think about January 6th, a year later, I almost think of two bookends in a way to the Trump presidency. Charlottesville in the summer of 2017 on one end, and January 6th in the waning days of his presidency on the other end of his presidency. These two bookends where you had, extremists coming to fight for him, to show their support. When you look back on January 6th, was it a victory for the hate groups that were involved in this, or was it a defeat?
I would say they always spin everything into some type of claim of victory. I have seen rallies canceled. I have that somehow became a celebration. There's something in the ideology, and it goes along with the belief in conspiracy and the power of spreading it, that the narrative just gets exactly where they want them to get. So I'll give you some examples. The Proud Boys, right? A group we've talked a lot about. They're actually here in Connecticut, where we are, Rob. They were there, and they have gathered steam on the heels of January 6th. 2021 was a growth year for them, and because January 6th enabled them to reach whole new audiences and mobilize on things that we're all facing in our local communities. Groups like the Proud Boys leveraged their name recognition there to insert themselves into anti-critical race theory debates at local school boards, and they're threatening members of communities with violence. And so it is definitely not hurt their recruiting or their next steps for where they want to go. However, also that day, it was clear that Donald Trump wasn't going to be voted in to continue to be president. So not having him there emboldening the movement, which started, like you said, before Charlottesville, but that was the first view we got of it. Not having him in the White House presents other challenges for them. I think we have a different Justice Department. And I think we have, frankly, a lot of the people who I work with in law enforcement, they've really, and this actually started, to be clear, toward the tail end of the Trump presidency, really beefing up their look at domestic terror, right-wing extremism. And here, I was working after January 6th. As you'll recall, the big next thing everybody was worried about was what's going to happen on Inauguration Day, right? What are we going to do then? And I and people, across the country in law enforcement were doing everything they could to prevent that from happening at state capitals. And don't forget, right? State capitals were a target earlier in the year before, when people were going in, stormed the Michigan State House, right? About going after the governor there, right? January 6th was a game changer, but it was in some ways, like I said, not surprising, and it did fuel things in the future. I also want to mention one point with respect to who they're prosecuting. And how they're going to address, who gets felony, who gets misdemeanor, who gets pled. There was a leak of a bunch of information of the Oath Keepers, this one right-wing group. And in there, it became clear that some people who were part of the planning and going to DC were active members of law enforcement and the military. and they were avowed members of this Oath Keepers group. So I think that as they do these investigations, and as more things come to light, assuming they keep going for it, there will be more and more convictions at the felony level. So, or pleas at that level. So, and by the way, one other thing, my college and law school roommate is a federal district court judge in DC,
Mhm.
and he would, I don't talk with him about specific cases, but he's an incredibly hardworking guy who has said that they just can't keep up with the volume of cases and give each case the what it is due for its level of import.
And the last thing I'll touch on, Steve, with you is, speaking of not being able to keep up with something, I mean, the ability for law enforcement to keep up with the activity of groups on social media and the organizing that goes on, the platform hopping that takes place. They're on Facebook one day, they're jumping over to another platform that no one's ever heard of the next, they're going to the dark web. Is it possible for law enforcement to really keep track of these groups, whether it's the hardcore far-right groups or the sort of wannabes that are out there? And what do you think that the future will be of law enforcement monitoring of social media after what was clearly a miss leading up to January 6th, where there was mass organization going on mainstream platforms that was simply not either investigated or taken seriously?
Yeah, well, I think law enforcement's ability, due to the constitutional rights, will forever be limited. Their ability to really track and monitor. That's why there are groups like Southern Poverty Law Center, ADL, that have teams of people monitoring, because they're not subject to the same probable cause restrictions that thank goodness our law enforcement are. I think that what we will see is, and we're seeing it in somewhat of a bipartisan way, is putting a lot more pressure on the social media platforms and companies to try to get them to they're not really policing themselves. And so the question will be, what will Congress do to regulate them? That's going to come. I think that, some of the bigger companies are asking for regulation because they know they can afford it and live with it. And hopefully they think that it's the right thing to do. But a lot of these smaller platforms, which are just saying we're the new town square, I think that the government will look at that a different way. I don't think law enforcement can do this alone. I don't think they ever will be able to. I don't know if we want them to. I think there's a real reluctance to the surveillance state here. I think that in the spring, in the Connecticut legislature, there was an idea to set up within the state police a special group focused on hate crimes and extremist and people following extremist ideology. And the civil rights community stood up and said, we really aren't all that excited about that. We want you to make sure you keep us safe, but we're not so sure that additional law enforcement is the key. So we're going to have to put pressure as community leaders, as people running big tech companies, and ultimately government regulation.
All right.
Can I speak to some of that, Rob?
Yes.
Okay, so I agree with the sentiments that Steve just gave, but some of the implementation is going to require some real finesse. And there are two pieces to it. First, with regard to social media, as I know, Rob, and I imagine Steve knows as well, if Twitter or Facebook decides to deplatform somebody, that is not a First Amendment issue. If a private actor decides that they are not going to make their platform available to somebody for any reason at all, other than the forbidden ones, race, sex, so forth,
yeah,
that is not a First Amendment issue. If you build a billboard, you don't have to let everybody use it.
Yeah.
But when you start talking about regulation, now you do have a First Amendment problem. And if the regulation turns on the content of the speech, you have a big First Amendment issue. So frankly, it's going to require groups like Facebook, and Rob, you and I went to college with somebody who used to be a very important lawyer at Facebook who left before some of this went from bad to worse. Groups like Facebook are going to have to show the backbone to say, we're doing this not because it's regulated, we're doing this because we think it's right. And if we anger some group of people, some segment of society, so be it. Because regulation is really a dangerous answer here. Second, with regard to the ability of law enforcement to do work, there are two separate things. One is their ability to do surveillance based upon electronic intercepts, monitoring what people are saying in conversations that they believe are private by wiretaps, things like that. That raises huge civil liberties issues. And I agree with Steve that that's going to be very problematic. The other thing that can be done and has been done in the past with extremist groups is simply having law enforcement send lots of undercover people to supposedly join the groups. If you saw the movie The Black Messiah, a significant portion of the Black Panthers were actually on the payroll of the FBI. If you take a look in Israel, a significant number of people who are supposedly a member of Fatah or Hamas are actually Israeli double agents. The FBI had in the South had a lot of undercover people who were a part of the Ku Klux Klan. And that sort of work does not raise civil liberties issues in most cases. It is very expensive. It's very personnel intensive. And it's a question of allocating resources. And it's something that can only be done, frankly, at the national level. If you have a police force in, I'm going to give an example from where we went to college, Rob. If you have a police force in Piermont, New Hampshire, that consists of 4 people, A, they're all going to be known to all of the local residents, and B, if you make one of them an undercover, you only have 3 police officers left. You need to have national law enforcement doing this work, and that needs to be prioritized to put boots undercover on the ground.
All right, well, we will leave it at that. Great points by both of you, and really appreciate all the time. Obviously, a really important conversation that is not about to stop. I think we're here on the first anniversary. There'll be more anniversaries, more conversations, more developments, both as to the criminal justice side of January 6, 2021, as well as the social side of it and the other impacts that we've seen it have throughout our society. So Mitch Epner, Steve Ginsburg, my friends, thank you both very much. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.